Okay, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us this evening for this, what I'm sure is going to be a lively discussion about women in leadership. At Imagine Cities, we host two different types of webcasts. Our Common Ground webcast focuses on the issues cities are facing, while our Outside the Box webcast brings brings folks in who are out there solving urban problems. There will be many perspectives shared in this webcast. We do our best to bring forward highly credible research and panelists. We encourage you to think about what is shared and feel free to poke holes in any of the arguments presented. So here we go. In the mid-1800s, Elizabeth Blackwell was living in London, England. At this time, she had become the first woman to receive a medical degree in the US. In England, she worked as a midwife. At the time in London, London was enduring the Great Stink. And if anyone knows about that time, you kind of did your business on the street, including the animals you own, horses and such. And the Great Stink, it was just a very hot summer, and things just the odors were not that great. So a lot of people were getting sick, and doctors at the time worked under this theory that what made people sick was the smell. But Elizabeth came out and said, actually, I think it's because folks aren't washing hands, including the very doctors that were treating patients. And it's kind of, we think of that, and nowadays, yeah, wash your hands, keep clean. But back then, a lot of people laughed off Elizabeth and her solution to the problem, and now washing hands is second nature. So the cities we live in are forged by leaders who make the final call. Not only leaders in government and our bureaucracy, but also urban planning firms, our financial services industry, and in our very communities. The cities we live in are part of a collective reflection of the decisions leaders make every day. A lack of diversity in leadership results in cities that not only serve a limited amount of people, but as in Elizabeth's case, can result in decisions that can be disastrous. One of those groups cities tend not to serve due to a lack of representation is women, and specifically women in leadership roles. Today, we explore the ways women experience cities and how cities would evolve if more women were at the helm. Today, we have brought together a group of accomplished panelists who are approaching this topic with a variety of different backgrounds. First up, we have Lorelei Higgins. She is the Indigenous Relations Strategist at the City of Calgary, with a background leading community-based peace and conflict transformation projects across the globe. Lorelei is well-versed in creating strong cultural connections to facilitate meaningful engagement. Lorelei has an MBA in leadership from Royal Roads University in Victoria, and recently took the lead on developing community connections as part of the City of Calgary's pandemic response team. We're also grateful to have Rachel Knight. Rachel is the Business Strategy Coordinator at Calgary Parking Authority, an established leader in the parking industry in both Toronto and Calgary. Rachel possesses an in-depth understanding of the role traffic and parking can play in city planning. She has a Bachelor of Arts in Biology and Geography from York University, and is a mentor for the Women in Parking program. And she was recently featured on CNN. It was a segment focused on the future of parking. Last but not least, we have Beth Sanders. She is the president of Populous Community Planning. She is also the author of Nest City, which is a book I have read and would recommend to anyone trying to understand the complexities of city building. Beth has worked in community planning for 15 years and brings a wealth of knowledge to our discussion on building cities for women. She has a master's degree in city planning from the University in Manitoba, as well as extensive experience as a city planner and relationship broker. So I'd like to welcome everyone to our webcast, Building Cities for Women. I wanted to start our conversation off essentially defining feminism. It's the advocacy of women's rights on the basis of equality of gender. For most of the Western world, the advocacy began in the late 1800s with France as the outlier. In France, these efforts actually started much earlier during the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. There are many reasons feminism is important, but I would like to learn from Beth, Lorelei, and Rachel why feminism is important to them. So to start this off, we'll have Beth.
Okay, thanks for the warm welcome to us all, Ron. Okay, so I don't feel like I have an easy answer, and we were joking before we started that, oh, you know, I feel unqualified to answer the question. And isn't that just a problem that women have, to tell ourselves that we feel unqualified? So I'll just say simply, Ron, that there's two things that motivate me in how I act or behave or show up. And one is from the inside, I want to make the best possible contribution to the world that I can do, and do what feels good to me, my soul, what the work that I'm called to do from deep inside. So that's from inside. On the outside, like, so the outside world, what motivates me are the words, "You can't do that," whether it's explicitly or implicitly. It kind of makes me want to do what I want to do anyway. But over time, I've learned that I don't always have to respond to the words, "You can't do that." I can choose to put my shoulder to the wheel when I feel like it, rather than just reacting to the outside world. That said, to get specific in response to your question, Ron, is when someone says to me, explicitly or it's implied, "You can't do that because the body that you're in is female," then I bristle. And it's not okay to say that something is okay or not okay because of the body that I'm in. So from that place, I've always had a sense of things should be equal for male bodies and female bodies. That's a belief I've had for a long time. That expands further out now as I understand more about other kinds of bodies, trans bodies, etc. So who do we want to be? Do we want to be the kind of culture that rules people out because of a certain feature of their body or not? So I'll just leave it there, because I know you've got more questions, and I'd love to hear what Rachel and Lorelei have to say.
Lorelei, did you want to chime in?
Okay, Danitara Ambawastich Tanche. Hello, everyone. Thanks also for the warm greeting. And Ron, I just want to thank you for the generosity you've bestowed upon us by telling everyone they can poke holes in the arguments, and that's a good thing, because we're here for discussion. So for all of you listening in, looking so forward to further discussion even after following this. So why is feminism important to me? I think the way I've always looked at it is it's a historical stake in the sand that said it's not okay. We can't continue as we are. And in a widespread movement, women came together and said, things need to change. And I think that system change only occurs when people have the ability to speak up and come together. And we know that feminism hasn't been perfect, and there's been a lot of, we still need to do more, and what about other groups? But what I appreciate about it is that it stopped a system of patriarchy that came into place unnaturally, and people came together and said, this isn't good enough. So that's definitely what I appreciate about it.
Thank you for that. Rachel, did you want to make?
Yeah, I think it just why feminism is important to me, because it kind of blurs the lines. I think it makes me realize that I can be both a mom and take that on. I have a 12-year-old son, but I can also work in an industry that is male dominated. So I think it gives really just access and opportunity for women that you typically wouldn't have. And when you start seeing women in different roles, you then start to realize that the opportunity is there for you too. And I think that's very important. So that's where I stand on why it's important to me.
Awesome. Thank you all. I really, when Beth talked about not being qualified in that conversation we had before this, and you're all women, and just not feeling qualified, that's something I think I'll sit on for a while, that part of the conversation. Next up, we have Sarah Jessica Parker. So in 2016, Sarah Jessica Parker famously stated that while she's not a feminist, she does believe in gender equality. Believing in gender equality is feminism, which led many to believe that she had an issue with the term feminism. She's among many women who don't use the term. Marissa Mayer, former CEO of Yahoo, stated the same. This time we'll start off with Lorelei, and the question is, why do you think Sarah and Marissa don't want to proclaim themselves as feminists or use the term feminism?
Thanks, Ron. I think that's a great question. I think it provokes debate and, makes us think about it. I think Beth said it really well. You shouldn't be judged because of the body you're in. So I think for me, at the heart of that argument that Sarah Jessica Parker and among many others were making is really that idea of, when do we get past that idea of, and she's a woman. So we are surprised by what women are doing. And it's like, it always ends with, and she's a woman. At what point are we just going to be human beings doing what we do and be acknowledging talents, and that gender does not have to play into the conversation? So that's, I've looked into that a bit, and that's sort of what stands out for me from that perspective around it.
Rachel?
I love that you use this as a question, because I'm a huge Sex and the City fan, probably watch it more than I should. But I would say this, I think in general, feminism typically feels one-sided. And I think what happens is it makes it feel like there's preference to a particular group. It's similar to the Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter issue. When there is, not enough information about it, I think it makes people feel uncomfortable. But I do like her response, Sarah's response, in that it's really, feminism is really around equality, gender equality, versus being kind of focused or related to preferred group. So I do love a response, though.
I think that some folks, their issue is that is the very definition of feminism. So, like, Beth, do you want to kind of chime in? Like, what is it about this term? Like, the very definition is gender equality. Like, when you search up feminism, this is what it is. So why do you think some women don't like to use the term?
Honestly, I can't really say, or I can't imagine what's going on for Sarah and Marissa. I know for myself, I've never been overly attached to the term, either offended or like the opposite of offended, like love it. It's, for me, the point is the equality, and the label is just a label. And when Lorelei was speaking, I was thinking, what if we weren't judged by the label we use, the same way we're asking to not be judged by the body we're in? And what if the point is equality or equity? What if that's the point? And I think at the end of the day, as humans, we really love like that fight drama. And soon as we attach a label to something, then it's like Dr. Seuss's The Sneetches, like who's who's got the label, who doesn't have the label. Like the label enables me, sometimes this is healthy, right? The label enables me to feel like I'm part of something. And when I don't like people who have that label, I still feel a part of my tribe that resists it, my group, I'll rephrase that, my group that resists it. And it helps us stay us, and then when we get too attached to a label. So maybe that's part of what's happening. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, the whole idea of labeling and instead of focusing on the issue itself. And I like Lorelai's point around, and she's a woman. You know, she's the chief city planner and she's a woman. Like, what does that matter? She's the chief city planner. You know what I mean? So I really enjoyed that. We're gonna dive in. So anytime I'm looking to the left, it's our teammate William who's telling me that I need to speed up or slow down. So just so you know, William Abokwe. So thank you, William. So in 1815, Sojourner Truth gave a speech called "Ain't I a Woman?" In it, she speaks of a man who told her that women need to be helped into carriages, lifted over ditches, and to have the best places everywhere. She then states that as a Black woman, nobody has ever helped her into carriages or over mud puddles or given her the best place. She ends this by asking, "Ain't I a woman?" Her speech emphasized the differences in the expectations between how white women were treated and continue to be treated today compared to Black women. There are many who argue that the experience has not changed and in many regards has gotten worse. 15 years before the end of slavery, and that's a key thing, before the end of slavery in the US, Black infant mortality was 340 per 1,000, while white mortality was 217 per 1,000. Today, it's 11.3 per 1,000 for Black women and 4.9 per 1,000 for white women. Black parents are twice as likely to lose their baby when compared to white parents. The disparity has grown. In Canada, Indigenous populations can face infant mortality that is 3 times higher than the average population. And it's important to note that Canada does not have data for Black women and other people of color. And that's a whole other conversation about the lack of race-based data in this country. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on the idea that the women's movement has been too focused on the needs of white women, and that the women making the decisions on the priority of women's rights do not include the voice of women of color. And we're going to start this off with Rachel and her thoughts.
I would say this. I think it comes down, in all honesty, I think sometimes the movement excludes Black women. I don't like to put Black women in a position, they're already oppressed, but I think there's some value in having the conversation and allow them to speak up on some of the issues. I think the reality is people don't know what they don't know. And I think it's important for Black women, women of color, to actually express what they're feeling, how they feel in the workplace, you know, how they feel around diversity inclusion, just their experiences. Because in reality, I know I would say in the last year, you know, 20 years of my career, I've never discussed it. In the last year since the George Floyd death is when I started to be very open and vocal about it. And I think when I say that people don't understand, people are shocked. So on the other side of it, I would say this, I would say when you are receiving the message, don't discredit it. You may not be interested in it, and that's fine. But I think there is some value in listening and not making the other person that's on the receiving end of it feel uncomfortable. So that's what I would say around that.
Beth, what are your thoughts?
So I'm 51, And I can remember about 25 years ago, so when I was about 26 and I was working in Brandon, Manitoba, and I plugged in with the United Nations Platform for Action group in Manitoba. And there was a point where, and we're all white, and there was a point where I was sent to Ottawa to a meeting of a range of Canadians. And I remember distinctly a Black woman saying, like, her needs are not met. We can't look only at these things because there's other groups of women. Like, it's not homogenous, right? And I didn't get it. Like, I remember feeling, I don't get it. I don't understand. So that's a memory that I have. When I think about today and your question, I'm not in the movement enough to know if that's true or not. I'm certainly not in a position to assess if it's true or not, because I'm one of those white women. So my operating principle that I'm learning to live in is that if someone is saying something to me about it's not working or I'm not represented, I have a choice to make about trusting, believing what the other is saying, even if I don't understand it. And if I find myself needing to understand, that's about me needing to understand. That's not about me accepting and trusting and believing what someone else is telling me. And that's a learning edge for me. So if voices are saying not feeling included, represented, the priority's wrong, then the answer is yes, that's true.
Before this conversation, Rachel and I had a conversation around neuroscience and how neuroscience is helping us understand why we tend to reject perspectives that we're not comfortable with. Why we do that right off the bat. And if folks want to learn more about that, feel free to check out our YouTube channel and take a look at some of the clips there. I think you'll get a better understanding and appreciation about how we react to perspectives that we're not comfortable with or we're not used to. So thank you both Rachel and Beth for that. And Lorelei, did you want to maybe talk a bit about this as well?
Yeah, I think like really important things have been raised. And Beth, I mean, what you've said is really powerful, you know, that ability to listen and to know you don't have all the answers. And I think maybe I'm just an eternal optimist, but I do think that when we know better, we do better. And so as we look at, you know, what's happened in history and what movements have happened or not happened, that idea of continual improvement and just listening to these wonderful women talking alongside me, there's great diversity within us three. And I know there's great power when people gather with good intentions. And so while there's definitely been lacking in the women's movement of diversity in some regards, I do think that there's great power in women coming together today. And for us to recognize that, hey, maybe we didn't do it totally right. Or, and you have a question later on, Ron, that I'll expand on this thought, but there's a lot of things that have happened in history that have also prevented full participation from women from other groups. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that. But I personally am thankful for the women who have fought hard to have the things that we do have. And I'm personally grateful for the women in positions of power and leadership who are recognizing the need to create more space and bring in other voices. So
thank you for that. Yeah, for sure. The appreciation of the hard work that's been done already is something that is a great message and reminder, celebrating those who have come before us. Thank you for that. So William is saying that I need to move on. So we're gonna start with talking about women and their experiences in cities. So we talked about feminism and how and just talking about the topic of feminism, and now we're going to switch that into relating it to cities. So YouGov conducted a survey in the UK in 2019 about how safe men and women felt in typical urban experiences. These are approximate results. So 51% of men feel safe when going on a first date compared to 11% of women. I mean, you can see the stats up there. It's pretty telling. One stat that I didn't include there is 1 in 3 women take steps on a regular basis to protect themselves from sexual assault. YouGov conducted the same survey in the US and found similar findings. So in our previous webcast, our Brain on Perspectives, we learned that much of the way we view the world is based on our lived experiences. Based on these results, women experience certain urban experiences much differently than men. Due to this, it is far likelier that women leaders would place safety as an issue of priority when compared to a male leader. So, my question is this, and we'll start off with Beth. Do you believe that women experience cities differently than men? And if so, can you give me another example of how women experience cities differently?
Sure. And it'd be nice at some point to question the idea that just because women are in leadership, that they do a better job. I'm just going to park that we would do a better job. So I think the point is recognizing that cities are settlements that we make for ourselves, and they serve as an artifact to tell us about what we value, right? So, and I'll go so far as to say, you know, the cities that we live in North America, they'll just be simple, or Alberta, because I'm from Edmonton. I just spilled the secret. But let's be honest, our cities are designed by white, cisgendered, middle class men. Not even designed by white, cisgendered, middle class women, white women, right? Like it's a very particular thing. So the question, do women experience it differently? Yes. Are they designed by women? No. Are they designed with women in mind? I'm going to say no. The example of how women experience cities differently, one of the first things that comes to mind for me is just simply how we move. So if the city is designed post-war for single-family dwellings, so think nuclear family, which is also an issue because we're designing for the nuclear family, a mom and a dad and 2 kids. And there's lots of relationships out there that do not fit that. And thou shalt live in a suburb, which we've replicated long after the war ended. And thou shalt have 1 car. That's how it started. So husband and wife, 1 car, woman's at home, man's off to work. There are 2 startlingly different experiences of the city. So, but if we look at the middle class family, and I know I'm being very narrow, if you have the funds to have a 2nd car, then both the man and the woman in a heterosexual relationship can easily move around the city. But the experience of many women is not as like a nuclear family with 2 cars. So then the question becomes, how are we able to move around the city? What choices do we have? And in the vast majority of North American cities, which are so car-centric, are very exclusive, economically, physically, like all of it, for women to move around the city. So even look at, so let's say you have buses and train. When are most of them running? For people to get to work at certain times of day, which again is exclusive. So I'll stop there because I want to hear what Rachel and Lorelai have to say.
And yeah, that's a great point on how we've built cities to represent a way of life that doesn't exist really anymore. So yeah, great point. I'll move things over to Lorelai, and can you give me an example of how women experience cities differently?
Yeah. Yeah, and I just want to give thanks to you, Beth, for giving some perspective too, you know, that cities can change and they're settlements that we make for ourselves. So what kind of experience do we want to have? And I think COVID is really helping us reimagine things. And as we're stuck out wherever we are, if it's the suburbs or inner city, that idea of complete communities. And for those of you who know some of my work, I've worked a lot with business improvement areas and how you experience the city through a built environment and how important that is to have an experience. And so the example I'm going to give is really sort of from a personal perspective. I have lived around the world. I've lived in Africa, South America. I've done it. I've adapted culturally. I've learned languages, and I've always felt quite confident. However, having young children has never made me more terrified in my life. I suddenly lost every skill set in Calgary because here I was running around looking for a place to breastfeed. Here I was looking for a place to change a diaper. I couldn't even move the stroller on a snowy day. And I can honestly say that how women experience cities may be different for everyone, but as a young mom in Calgary, I certainly struggled in ways that I never imagined. And it made me look at cities in a new way. And when my husband went off to work, that feeling of isolation, of like, here I am out in the suburb with a crying, screaming baby that I have no idea what to do with. And so I can say my lens has definitely been altered by becoming a mom. Thank goodness they're 8 and 6 now, so I figured out a few things. But what I can say made the biggest difference and how women experience cities that does make a big difference is connectivity. So if you can find people that you can actively connect with and you can find a way to work through the city, you can survive. But it doesn't mean the city's been built for you to survive, right? And so I love this idea right now of like this reimagining that can happen in this liminal space that we seem to be in with COVID.
That's, yeah, it's like when I think of when all actually some of you came on here onto the chat and stuff, and I started thinking about the way women experience cities. Nowhere did I ever think of breastfeeding. It was not top of mind. I'm sorry, but it was not top of mind, and that's so obvious now.
Sorry, Ron, it's a big deal.
Yeah, it is. It is. Yeah. It is, and that's just an example, right? Of, you know, even when I'm thinking about the topic, and in a very real way, I cannot, you know. Anyways, I would like to now move things over to Rachel and hear what you have to say. I know that you're putting your little one. You had to do something with your little one. I forgot what you had to do, but I started thinking about how many men have come on our webcast and said, "I have to put my son or daughter to sleep." I don't think there's been one. So please, let's hear what you have to say.
I would actually just add to Laurel's experience because mine is exactly the same. I don't think I viewed the city any different until I had a child. I lived in downtown Toronto. My husband took the car to work, but I had the accessibility to, you know, walk around, spend time with my son, and I did it in a stroller or a carrier. But when you talk about breastfeeding, I remember breastfeeding on a streetcar. I remember changing my son on a streetcar. And it's certain the design part of it, like how sidewalks are designed, if there's snow clearing, if there's ice clearing, it changes your day. And it changes your perspective and you view kind of your activity and it's more planned out. Whereas before a child, I never did that. I just went on my way. So I would say I believe there's that safety aspect, and I think it's very important in making sure that there's design related to safety. But I think there's also, when we talk about inclusivity, is around, you know, women with children, and we talk about too as a population ages. I've seen many opportunities where, you know, there's not the proper snow clearing, so people can't get around with a walker, and people are stuck at home because they don't have that accessibility. So I would say it's very important that we look at kind of all aspects of it and have all the people at the table so that, you know, when we're talking about designing cities, that, you know, everyone is included in the process because everyone is affected differently.
Yeah, as I'm looking at the screen, I'm looking at number 1, went on a first date. Now looking at this statistic, I'm just like, okay, I think I had a way different experience my first date with my partner than my partner did. So like, I just, you know, you start thinking about, oh man, like she was going through, you know, she was different thoughts going through her mind, I'm sure. But anyways, let's not digress. Let's move into the next question. So thank you all for that. The next question revolves similarly around what Beth was talking about and how women move in a city. So in 2015, Ada Colau was the first woman to ever be elected mayor of Barcelona. Surveys in Barcelona have shown that women use public transit, biking, and walking to get around the city, while men tend to drive more. Prior to Ada, much of Barcelona's mobility investment was focused on cars. Since her election, more resources have been put into transit, biking, and walkability. For some of you city nerds out there, you can see the image on the right, and that's that's Superblock, and it's a strategy that she has put forward in order to build more walkable, more bikeable cities in which you can get what you need within you know, a 15-minute walk. So my question to you then is there a government outside, a municipal government outside of Barcelona that you think does a good job at understanding how women use infrastructure? And if not, how can governments do a better job at building infrastructure that better serves the needs of women? And we'll start off with Lorelei.
I'm going to give a two-part answer. So the one will be the direct, in terms of actual like physical.
I think Lorelei is frozen. Give it 1 minute. Sure, it'll clear up. Well, let's wait until Lorelei's good. Her connection will clear up, but maybe we can move on to, oh, Lorelei. Okay, you froze there for a sec.
Oh, I was just stalling for an answer. So what I was saying.
Yeah.
I got some more time there. What I was saying, and it's just that I'm always partial to countries like Denmark and to Sweden and to Finland. I've worked in Finland particularly, and I find that there's like a way of getting around the city that seems easier. There's a lot more options, very bike centric, especially in Copenhagen in particular. There's a reason they rate #1 on the happiness index. So I would say I'm partial to that. But in terms of not just, if I think beyond the physical infrastructure, I know this isn't really the question, but what I'm interested in too is the social infrastructure. So how people combine that physical infrastructure into social infrastructure. And we won't have time to really go into the example, but I encourage everybody to look at the Philippines, which isn't a case study that often in terms of social infrastructure. They're well known for their strong family units typically, but I had the chance to work in a region called Paquibato. And there's been a peace process underway. And in 40 years of violence, it took a female mayor and a woman leading a committee through City Hall. She was the peace advisor to the mayor to actually bring out peace in the region after 40 years. And what they did, and this is we won't get into it, but in terms of social infrastructure, they asked the people what they were worried about. And no one had asked the people, like, what's actually going on socially for you? You know, there's lots of ways to get around, but what's going on socially? So they asked people and they said, we're afraid of violence and we don't have access to food. So the women got together and they created a bunch of different ways to get food into schools. They did training on growing vegetables and vegetable gardens. And this was in 2018. In 2019, they celebrated an entire year without violence. And the end result was that they established like a hotline for people who wanted to call in around what they were feeling, what they needed through the social infrastructure. And from that, the rebels started calling in from the violent movement, and 92 rebels ended up surrendering. And so anyway, that is an interesting parallel for me in terms of what's important about sort of that built environment and what's important about the social environment. And when I saw that question, I thought how women would think differently potentially in that scenario. And it was a female mayor. and Irene Santiago, peace leader, who actually came up with, what if we asked people what they were worried about? So I just wanted to layer that into the conversation as part of what might be important to consider in terms of other types of infrastructure.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that story. That was really powerful. So I will adapt this question to include social infrastructure. So so next up, we'll go to Rachel. And so is there a government outside of Barcelona that you think does a good job at understanding how women use social and physical infrastructure? And if not, how do you think governments can do a better job at better understanding the needs of women?
Obviously, we get these questions in advance, so I started to do some research myself. And what I found was Vienna, Austria, does a great job. And what they do, similar to what Laura mentioned, is engagement. They started to really engage both men and women and index that information, but specifically around transit. And what they saw was that the needs of men and women were different. And how they operated through transit was very different. And what they decided to do was really look at how some of their policies and procedures would deal with that. And they looked at park design, they looked at some of residential redevelopment pieces and how that would play into it. So residential pieces, they would have multiple uses on site, because what they discovered is that women do more multiple trips, mainly related to children, and how would they have that access to do it so that they had time to actually spend with their family. Also, what was very interesting about that too is that it was coming from the municipal level. So what's interesting to see is that can also come from, you know, applicants coming in, be it developers, be it transportation consultants and whatnot, having that ability to kind of push the city to kind of push those initiatives. And I think the way they describe this kind of movement is around gender mainstreaming and making sure that policies, processes, council approvals work around that.
Gender mainstreaming. Yeah, I'm happy you brought up that term. We've been seeing a lot of that research. We've done a lot of research into gender mainstreaming, and more municipal governments putting that gender lens over policies that they're developing. So thank you so much for that example. Beth, your turn. You're up next. So and like I said earlier, you can use either social or physical infrastructure.
I'm going to use both. I'm going to opt for both. So I was sort of chuckling because, you know, part one to the question is there a government that does a better job? And in my brain, I'm going, I'm not a researcher. This would be a really good question for a researcher. And then I love how Lorelei and Rachel are like little researchers. So I'm going to focus on the, like, how could government do a better job? And I think it's about having governments that represent the people they serve. So like gender-wise, racial-wise, like all those different intersections, that is a thing. But when we're imagining building or rebuilding infrastructure, the fundamental question we should be asking is, what is its purpose? And its purpose should be both about the social and the physical. So one of the models that I use when I'm thinking about cities is, like, we use the language, I'm in Edmonton and we talk about city building all the time. City building is only half of the equation. It's the, like, what are we going to build and how do we regulate it and what money are we going to spend on it, which honestly is a very masculine way of thinking. It's physical. It's, you know, it's on the outside and it's physical. But Lorelai's asking us to think about, like, the social, like, so if we're building, how are we building care into what we build? And the way I look at it is if you put both of those things together, like that you've got something physical that works and it actually cares for people and their needs and the diversity of needs, then we're making a place. So then we get into city making as opposed to city building, and it needs care to come along with it. And I think in that question around, so what is the purpose of the infrastructure? Probably, not probably, it needs to serve multiple purposes. So it's gonna, who are all of the users that we imagine are going to use it, and what are their needs? Ask those questions, listen to the answers, ask those questions of the right people, and then just because we understand something, then the next question is, so what are we going to do about it? So there has to be a follow-up to actually do something with what we know and understand differently. So it's not even sufficient to ask the question like, do we understand? Does the city understand what it needs to do? I don't care if they understand. I care if they understand and they're going to do something about it.
Yeah, I think you bring up two good points there. One being outcome. We tend to focus, I think, taxes, no taxes, that is a popular conversation. We tend to focus on those things more than we ask the question, what outcomes are we looking for? And how can we get there? And, there's various tools that we can use in order to try to get there. So I think great point there. The second piece is city maker or city making. I thought that was a great piece. And I think that all of our Imagine Cities folks listening, we're going to have to edit our white paper. We're going to have to change up our website there, because I think city making is such a better verb to use. And we'll definitely get on that. So thank you so much to all three of you for those comments. So we're going to switch things over, and we're going to now relate this topic to equity. So I'm going to switch that. So in the book Subdivided: City Building in an Age of Hyperdiversity, there's a chapter called Model Citizen. This is another book I recommend folks to read, especially if you're interested in this topic. In this, two women share their stories about the challenges of growing up in a marginalized community while still trying to have a voice in the decisions being made that shape their communities. There's a layer of difficulty in being a woman and having a voice. There's another layer of difficulty being a woman of color and having a voice. And then there's being a woman of color in a marginalized community with kids and having a voice. That is, I don't know how they do it. But when reading this book and these various layers of diversity, I kept on thinking, especially with this chapter, is what is it in society or wherever why is it that we devalue these voices and the decisions we make, or the voices we choose to listen to? So to start this off, we'll check in with Rachel. What are your thoughts on this topic?
Well, I would say this, it's one of those things when it comes to, it's just, there's this understanding or this thought that we don't know what's best for us. It could be related to colonization. It can be related to unconscious bias. I'm always in a position where, particularly in my professional life, where you don't know better. And that assumption is based on the way I look, maybe some of my background, maybe I don't have the education. And there's that loss of like intelligence or, not accepting my life experiences. So I think it's just related to the fact that we don't see enough women or Black women or women of color in some of these roles or these high-end roles. So the intelligent level, or the understanding is the intelligence levels, is not as high. So you don't know what's best for you. And as a person, I've actually saw a couple webinars with Jay and around, I grew up in social housing myself. I've lived there for a number of years, and, I remember how it was treated and how my family was treated. And I think there's some understanding of, you don't know what's better for you, so we're going to tell you, and what you have to say is not that important. So it's just really devaluing that input from people of color or Black people.
Yeah, great point. In this book, they talk about the city doing this consultation session for a new development, and they weren't including, those who are homeless, and, a variety of different, especially those who are homeless. And a group came out, self-organized, and said, we're going to hear these voices. And they specifically created events tied around, those who are homeless, but also those who can't fit into the schedule that the city's created, which tends to be sometimes during the day when people are working, or in the evening when, a lot of low-income workers are working in factories and stuff like that. So it really limits the voices that they hear, and they even extend it further. They just are there to serve a particular segment, which are who are those who have capital. So Lorelei, I was hoping you could chime in on this as well. So why do we devalue these voices in the decisions we make? And have you had any experiences in which we've, in your various roles, in which we could do a better job at listening to more diverse voices?
Right. Yeah, I have some stories that now I can look at with humor. Some are more recent. I don't know if the devaluing is always intentional, but I do, earlier on in the conversation, we talked about that familiarity. So you kind of trust people that look like you. And then what if they have an accent? Well, now you have I'm not going to understand them. And so I think there's that similarity bias that starts to happen a little bit. And so Rachel said it right. When we don't see people that look like us, then no one's finding us similar, and then we're being devalued. So I think there's something sort of unconscious around a bias that starts to happen. And I think there's also cognitive dissonance. So you never want to be wrong. And so when someone comes in and is like, well, this was wrong and that was wrong, your brain, going back to neuroscience, wants to be right. And so it wants to bring it closer back to what it thought. And so it tries to reduce that cognitive dissonance. And so I think there's a bunch of things at play when something's devalued. And it's not just as simple as like, they just wrote me off. So I personally have had to work really hard with all of those layers. I've been introduced at sessions as an Indigenous person who overcame the odds and isn't addicted and on the streets. So I've been introduced as early as last year in that way, in a giant forum in California. And so I just went on the stage and said, well, that's one way to be introduced. And I said, well, let me tell you about my life. So it was very insulting, but of course you use that to the benefit of the presentation, right? I've also been discounted being female alone, and sat at boardroom tables and basically told you wouldn't know anything about this. So I've had to do things like get an MBA so that I can be taken seriously in the business world. But I have learned along the way that learning the language of people and finding out what's important is what gets you into conversation. So while I don't always look like everybody, or I don't have the right gender or the right skin color or the right background or the right family, I can create bridges. And so if I know MBA language, well, now I have a seat at the business table, right? And so if I can speak Spanish, then I can. And so I've personally tried really hard to figure out how I can create bridges of understanding. How can I get into people's worlds that seem a little bit closed and kind of infiltrate it a bit? And before you know it, they're like, oh, that's just Lorelei. She's just here. But it's been an intentional effort to try to almost make myself a safe person so that I can be part of the conversation. I don't think it's always going to be like that. And one of the more interesting barriers that I face, and it's daily, is quite often I'm not Indigenous enough. And so my family's Métis, and I've actually been told that because I didn't go to school personally to residential school, and that I didn't grow up on a reserve, that I don't have what it takes to be Indigenous. And so I definitely faced the gambit from being too young to being female to being Indigenous to not being Indigenous enough. So I can tell you that if I walked around feeling devalued my entire life, I probably would not have achieved much. But all of that has made me more interested to actually create bridges of understanding and to figure out how I reduce people's biases that might be occurring and kind of make myself a place at the table till eventually I just become normal at the table.
Wow. Wow. Okay. Didn't expect that. So thank you for sharing. Thank you for being vulnerable and sharing your story. I really, really appreciate it. Beth, what are your thoughts on this? And have you, as a planner, as a very experienced, very accomplished planner, have you, like, what has your experiences been, and can you maybe give us the perspective of the city, maybe, or a municipal administration?
Well, I'm having a bit of a reaction to Lorelei's words, and Rachel's too, and yours too, Ron, that like all three of you in a way have really nicely described how the devaluing happens. So time of day, explicit or subtle racist remarks, like that's how it happens. But the question underneath that, which you posed at the outset, Ron, so I'm not avoiding your next question, but like, so why do we devalue these voices? And I think at the end of the day, the why it's part of that superiority thing that Rachel was talking about and it's about power, honestly. So, and I see this in government, I see this as a white person, I see it in my family, is the moment I'm uncomfortable by someone else saying maybe their needs are not met, then I have some grappling to do and I'm uncomfortable. I don't like pain, and all of us humans want to avoid that like the plague, pun intended. Like we want to avoid that discomfort, because what would be easier is to maintain the status quo. And I experience a degree of comfort with the status quo, and it might be the privilege I have because I grew up in a white body. So that's, to hear that I have something that's unearned, like that's taken me a while to get comfortable with that thought. But if I don't like to feel uncomfortable, then I'm going to devalue when someone else is offering a perspective that requires me to test my understanding of myself. And this is system-wide, but it's also in each of us and our willingness to be a little or a lot uncomfortable. And governments, for sure, especially if they're made up of a bunch of white people at the top, which by and large they are, then that is just happening at that scale as well. How willing are we to actually look with equity lenses, gender, racial, et cetera, at the decisions that we're making for our cities? How willing are we to do that as businesses or a social service organization? We're generally not, because we've got a lot of comfort in the way things have been. And even women, we know how it works. We know how the system works and how to navigate the power. So even when it's in our interest, we will reinforce the status quo because that's the game we know, rather than have to play a game we don't know. So.
Yeah. The game we know versus the game we don't know. Such a powerful point that you've made, and with regards to the decisions we make, and who we allow at the table and who we don't allow at the table. I tend to see tables in which folks who challenge the status quo tend to they don't get reinvited. They don't get invited back, and I get invited back because I am guilty of staying quiet, and that's something I need to examine myself as well, is not why I don't stand up for those who have a different perspective or challenge the status quo. So next up, we're going to transition to a section we call Advice to Leadership. But before we get there, for a variety of reasons, we tend not to bring up politics, and as an organization, we have committed to not bring any politicians onto our webcasts unless they are specialized in a topic we're covering before they became elected. And the reason we do that is we want to broaden the tent of who is responsible or who feels responsible for the cities we build. And it's not just our elected officials, it's all of us. But with that said, this historic event is too big to pass up even for our rules. On November 7th, 2020, Kamala Harris became the first first Black woman, and first South Asian woman elected Vice President of the United States. Putting aside preference in political party, this is a big day, or this was a big day. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this and what it means, to be a woman and to live in this time in which a woman has been elected vice president. And what are your thoughts to those who want to become leaders someday, just like yourselves are leaders within your respective places. So to start this off, I thought we would go with Lorelei. What are your thoughts on this?
Okay, I'm gonna say it. It hasn't been popular, but I got invited back to the table after I said it. So maybe there's hope, Ron. So what I really think is, as a leader, especially women who desire to become leaders one day, that idea of status quo, and I like what Beth said about once status quo is changed, it's really uncomfortable. So I had this thought, it was about last year, and I was like, wow, it's really nice that all of you are making space at the table. And then as a joke, I was like, I'm gonna need another 2 inches, right? So I want a little more space. And so I actually said a few months ago, I was like, well, the space at the table has been really nice, but can you move? I actually just want this table. And so that's the advice I'd give to leaders is don't settle for an inch or 2 inches. Go for what you need and what you want. And it is at the risk of maybe you're not invited back to the table, but that thing about maybe tables aren't needed anyway. Maybe we should sit in a circle and hold hands. That's what our elders say anyway. I would just say be bold. And when you reach a point where you can take some calculated risks, I think they're worth taking. And even at a point when you can't take some calculated risks, they're probably worth taking. And so, yeah, what I've definitely learned as I grow in age and courage is to not politely ask for a seat at the table, but starting to ask to just have the table and as much space as I'd like.
Great point. Yeah, why? That's a great point. Not ask for 2 inches and be polite. Just not even, I don't even know why I use that term, polite. Why ask for 2 inches when you can have the entire table and be deserving of it? So I feel like I've just used terminology that might be a bit offensive, but we'll have Beth chime in on the language I've used. But also your thoughts on the election of Kamala Harris, and what advice do you have for women who want to become leaders themselves?
Well, I'm excited about Kamala Harris. I just think it's kind of cool that a woman gets elected to the White House. Long overdue, long overdue. So I'm excited about that. And then I was chatting with a South Asian friend who has a little girl, and the little girl has a South Asian mom and a Black dad. And so my friend is like fangirl vibrating. Like normally the politics, she would not like some of what Kamala Harris stands for in terms of industrial prisons and like all that kind of stuff. But she is so excited that, you know, her little girl, who I think is 7 or something like that, has an example. And I'm like, okay, like, yeah. My advice to leaders who want to do a better job of serving women, well, maybe the advice for leaders and the capital L leaders and the small L leaders. Capital L leaders, don't imagine for a moment that you can ever get it right the first time. There has to be tolerance for mistakes. So to the small L leaders, that like those of us who are electing leaders or working for the big wigs, is we do have to cut them some slack so that they're willing to try things that are different and not hang them out to dry when they make mistakes. If it's a big mistake, hang them out to dry. But we need to discern when to get angry and furious with people and when to give them space so that they will say, I screwed up. I should have done something differently. I regret I did this. I wish I did, whatever it is they need to say so that they can learn publicly and then reveal more about what we need, who we need to be as people now.
And Rachel, your thoughts?
Well, to Beth's point, I'm that little girl. Like the idea that I can see, you know, a woman who's South Asian woman, a Black woman from Jamaica, which is a part of my heritage, in that role makes me feel great. And, you know, we as a family celebrated. I didn't even know she was Jamaican until it was all over Instagram. And it makes me feel happy. And when we talk about the table, it's a really weird place to be, in the sense, and I'm going to quote Drake here, I'm not really concerned. I don't want any new friends. In the sense that if me being vocal is going to mean that you don't want to be my friend, I don't really care. So when we talk about it, it is allies. What I've learned throughout my career is finding those allies, and I will lean on them. And so if what I'm saying makes you feel uncomfortable or is somewhat calling you out, I get it, and I get that it's uncomfortable, but it's the truth. So what my kind of view going throughout my career, Ron, you mentioned you're scared, not scared, but you don't necessarily kind of rock the boat. 2020 is about rocking the boat, and it's scary for people, but I've been silent for 20 years. So now is my time to be vocal. So if you have to deal with it for 1 year, and I just, you know, like back to Kamala Harris, it makes me feel great to know that there's opportunity for me. And even though it may not happen within kind of my lifetime in my career, I kind of lean on the people that I know are going to support me.
Yeah, the rocking the boat is kind of like this, this thing where you get labeled, right? And does it ruin opportunity for me? And it comes from a very self-serving place, right? It's like, okay, if I rock the boat, this person, this white leader who doesn't understand this topic, are they going to then look at me and say, well, moving forward, if there is a leadership role or any sort of opportunity, we don't want Ron at the table because Ron's going to rock the boat, and we don't want that. And it's something that is very challenging, especially when I am someone who tries to bring others up, and if and the thing is if I'm not in that leadership role, how do I bring other people up? And I don't know. It's a very big thing for me, and I actually don't want to turn this conversation about me, so I'm just going to stop talking about myself. Okay, so I think the next you talked about some interesting things around not rocking the boat and bringing others along with you, and I tend to have this struggle, right? And it's around, I label it the, I used images within this presentation that are very dated, like the oldest going back to the French Revolution. And at what point is enough enough, right? Like this movement, or the women's movement, has existed since then, since the French Revolution. And we're still here talking about very basic things around building, around women having a voice at the table. So sometimes I just like let's, revolt. And then other times I'm like, let's pull people along. So my question to you then is, like, how do you deal with that? Like, how do you deal with the fact that this movement has been around for so long? So many women have fought for women's rights, the right to vote, the right to buy a house, the right, like, you know what I mean? Like, the right to exist on a land title, right? To borrow from a bank. Like, these are recent, very recent things that have happened. And like, how do you deal with that? Because I struggle. I fall in between. Sometimes I'm like, this really upsets me and this needs to change today. And then other times I'm like, let's pull people along. Let's let them see the light, or let's be patient. And I don't know. Maybe we can start with Beth. Like, do you struggle with that? And if you do, like, how do you deal with it?
So as I'm listening to you, I'm realizing I've reflected a lot in the last few years. My marriage ended. I was allowed to leave the marriage. I was allowed to buy a house. I have my name on a title. I have a bank loan. I have work. I have all kinds of things. Like, there is a ton of work that took place for me to be in the safety and security that I am in right now. So what I'm going to say comes from that place, though, of being able to do that, which means for me, I'm in a position where I can say, yeah, like, let this take its time. But there are other voices out there that are feeling the pressure that I don't feel, that feel more adamant that now is the time to do things. And I feel a responsibility to stand with, not from a place of my comfort, but that willingness again to be uncomfortable. So then what it means is it's not my agenda, because I'm already comfortable. I have to be willing to be uncomfortable, not stop things and require others to stay uncomfortable because they don't have the privileges that I.
That's interesting, because I guess when you bring in different levels of diversity into this conversation, like women of color might feel differently because their rights, the rights of women of color, have come later as well. So I'd love to hear Lorelei and your thoughts, especially being a woman with an Indigenous, who is Indigenous, who's Métis, and all the history there. Like what are your thoughts? Like, how do you manage, especially someone who is Métis?
Yeah, I think it's what both you were saying. Some days you're so impatient and it's like you can't go fast enough, and other days you're like, okay, we just need to let it sit. So one of my tactics, honestly, is I spend a lot of time with the elders and up on this medicine wheel on Nose Hill. So I do try really hard to listen to the lessons of what I'm being told, that sometimes there's a season and a reason, and there is definitely a pace to how things happen. And sometimes the younger person in me just is so impatient, but then the elders say, just wait. So I think there's some validity to that. But I also think too, looking at what leaders can do, and this is where I've really been able to find a voice, is advocating for fellow Indigenous people, especially working in like a large corporation. Somebody actually said, they were like, you know, we can't find the right Indigenous person. Like, why don't Indigenous people have PhDs? Like, and I said, hey, have you looked at the most racist piece of legislation in Canadian history called the Indian Act? And I was like, for a really long time, especially women had to choose between going to school or keeping their status at any point. You know, leaving a marriage, you lose your status. Marry off reserve, you lose your status. So I said it's not actually okay for you to say, why don't more women have PhDs who are Indigenous, because we can't find the right candidate. And so I think that's one of the things when I think about, you know, what could leaders do a better job of, is to like actually value lived experiences. And if someone says, hey, I'm Indigenous, I don't have a PhD, maybe ask them why. Maybe you'll learn something about our history. And then maybe you'll realize, hey, they don't need a PhD, because that other knows more than I'll ever know in my entire lifetime. So that being said, I definitely feel impatient at times, and I definitely have to take those deep breaths. But I do know there is wisdom in those divine timings when things come together and it's easy. So what I've learned to listen to too is when things are coming together and a movement is ready, it just comes together. And I think a conversation like this is a great example. So it was easy to come together. COVID's made it really easy. But we're talking about things that maybe haven't always been easy to talk about. And in this season, some of the reason we have is we have an increased ability to dialogue. You know, Beth's way over in Edmonton. And so this is increased that ability for us to connect. And so, yeah, I think I walk that fine line of figuring out pace and how strong and how much, but I have learned to lean on other people and to actually know that I don't have all the answers. And one of the parts of me being successful is to surround myself with people who know, and then to advocate for their voice, to actually say, actually, this person really does know. They don't have a PhD, maybe, but they know. So I don't know if that helps, Ron.
No,
That's where I'm at.
And this comes back to that whole value, right? And devalue. You know, yeah. Folks will say, oh, there's no qualified people of color, and they don't ask why. You know,
exactly.
where I think about a statistic in the city of Toronto where more than half of the population in low-income communities have a diploma or degree, and 68% of these communities are people of color. And yeah, anyways, I struggle with that, and I obviously see that you struggle with it as well. And so I know William is asking me to move on, but I can't, William, because Rachel needs to chime in on this. I know that she she heard this question and she's like, yeah, I got something to say. So so Rachel, please.
William, I'll keep it quick. I would say this, and I'm going to keep this kind of really personal, because for me, I think my experiences around racism kind of hit a level at its all-time peak being in Calgary. Moving from Toronto to Calgary is where I've experienced the most, be it in my personal and professional life. I've been persecuted, harassed, for speaking out, and I will not stop. And I've made it very clear I will not stop, because I do have a son that I need to protect. And it's important to me that he doesn't have to go through the things that I went through. I made a conscious effort for me after the George Floyd death in 2020 to change my view and speaking out on it, on the issues of racism, but more forcing leaders to be very diverse and inclusive. And I'm not talking about tokenistic type of gestures. I'm talking about having leaders that look, act, think different than them at the table. The good thing about it is I don't necessarily want to be at the leadership table anymore. So I've redefined what leadership means to me. Doesn't mean for me to be at the table. It's me to hold our leadership accountable. So that's what I try to do. And it's easier it's a little bit easier down at the lower levels to do it. So that's kind of the perception for me. And so it's really actually defining what success means. Success in the past used to mean getting a manager job and, you know, making a certain amount of money and living a certain amount of like life. And that doesn't matter to me. It's, is there change in the organization? I'm holding you accountable. I'm going to harass you. You're going to have to deal with it. And that's it.
Yeah, I think about what you say, and the first, to be honest, I'm listening to what you're saying, and obviously, I think everyone can guess on this. The red light started coming up for me, right? So I just commend your just bravery and just, you know, sticking up, because I also read about folks who have done it in the past and what they have had to sacrifice to provide us with what we have today. So still continues to be a challenge. So we're going to conclude this conversation. So I just wanted to thank all the panelists and guests for joining us today. It was quite an exploration of a very important topic that's being widely discussed at the moment. I'd also like to thank all the volunteers of Imagine Cities, including our webcast production team. Across our organization, we have 53 volunteers from across the world, spread across 12 teams. I know Pratik was on here. He is based out of India. Take a look at our website and find you know, more volunteer opportunities that we have. And you can follow us on most social media platforms. Sign up for our newsletter on our website, imagincities.com. If you know people, companies, and organizations who are interested in, who may be interested in our work, encourage them to join our community of creative problem solvers. Just a reminder to be careful with your social media consumption. I can't promote social media without this public service announcement. Our health advisory recommendations are to take off your notifications, detox from social media regularly. I mean, put your phone away. Don't turn on your phone as soon as you wake up. Put your phone away at least an hour before bed, and follow content creators that bring you credible knowledge, joy, and happiness. So stay tuned as we pilot more programs and products to support building better cities. We are city makers, as Beth noted. Feedback is always appreciated. Thank you for joining us, and have a good night.